Notebook on Cities and Culture's upcoming third season will take it to Japan, Mexico City, Vancouver, and elsewhere, if and only if we can raise $4,000 to fund it. The Kickstarter drive is going on right now until December 21st. For details on how you can help the show go fully international, visit colinmarshall.org. This episode of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by the Brad and Laramie on Movies podcast, featuring talk on film, DVD, and industry happenings, available on iTunes everywhere. And by Gail Poole's book, Faint Praise, The Plight of Book Reviewing in America, essential reading for everyone interested in the state of book criticism today. Season 2 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. I examine my own reading habits on the internet, and I think about what reads well on the internet, and it leads me to believe that we're getting into a new golden age of the essay because of how we read on the internet. Do you think that's true?
You know, it's turning out to be true. More true than people suggested to me when we first started out. At the very beginning, people said nobody reads long form on the internet. This is a crazy idea. This is a dumb idea. You need to be short. People are sneaking the reading at work, and they don't want to get caught, and they can't get sucked into a. I mean, we've published one piece that was 20,000 words, several that were 14 and 15,000 words, and people do not seem to mind it. There's some drop off. We can tell that when there's drop off on the very, very long pieces, but the 3,000 word piece, the 4,000 word piece, the 5,000 word piece, people seem to be very happy to have them.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down here in Silver Lake with Tom Lutz, who teaches creative writing at the University of California, Riverside. He's the author of Crying American Nervousness, Doing Nothing, and Cosmopolitan Vistas. He's also the founding editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books, which, you started when I was wrapping up my time with a day job, but I feel like in a day job, all I wanted was long-form pieces, essays. I'd go to longform.org or Long Reads or the New Yorker or the New York Review of Books. It seems like if you're going to sneak reading at work, that's you want an absorbing piece that's a few thousand words, right?
I think that that authors want to be able to write what they need to write about whatever the subject is, whatever their essay is based on, whatever the review essay is. A lot of people, the pros all say how many words and what's the deadline. And my response is always, I want the material to determine the length, not the length to determine the material. Mm-hmm. And so we let people go as long as they need, and that I think has been very successful. That is, we don't, if people really want guidelines, I give them to them. But since the writer is making very fundamental decisions about what's important and what's not important, I think that the essay length just simply reflects that, and in that way, the readerly experience is a reflection of what that writer is doing their best to get across.
In your experience so far, then, editing the Los Angeles Review of Books, what have you learned about how many words material needs? What are the demands of the variety of material you've published as far as the length they need, and if that length is a readable length, and what the drop-off or lack thereof tells you?
Well, it varies very much piece to piece. If you're writing 1,500 words about in a dull way about a dull subject, people are going to drop off very quickly.
100 words about a dull subject in a dull way, they're not going to stick with you.
Exactly. So, one of my favorite pieces we did this year was Paul Mandelbaum went to Romania, where his mother grew up. In the shadow of the Nazis, escaped the Nazis, and it was a meditation on his mother and his mother's life. And at the same time, he went around and interviewed all of the great Romanian writers. And so it's a piece about Romanian literature, and it's a piece about his mother. And it took I think 17,000 words for that to come all the way around. And I don't think anybody minded that. Not a lot of people jumped at the chance of reading an essay about Romanian literature. I don't know why, because I love Romanian culture, but I love Romanian film. I love Romanian writing. So for me, it was I was in from the start. But and I think that in a case like that, people have to have some pre-existing interest to draw them in, or just a kind of curiosity about world literatures or something else. And that's that once people were in that, they seemed to go to the end of it. Because it was a fascinating combination of things, and he's a great writer. So it didn't matter how long it was. People were in for the ride.
I've thought often reading essays elsewhere, 10 times out of 10, rather read someone writing about something that interests them and writing passionately with interest than them sort of manhandling a subject they think might interest me or a reader. You mentioned your love of Romanian culture, and that seems to have facilitated this piece on Romanian literature getting its way into the Los Angeles Review of Books. And I've thought of write what you want to read as such a guiding principle for writing. How much is publish what you want to read a guiding principle for you as an editor?
We get pitched 100 pitches a day, and obviously we can't do all of them. And so when I'm going through those pitches, obviously the things that make me perk up are the things that we consider. But we have a series of senior editors. We have people reading through those pitches, all of whom have their own commitments and their own passions, and they choose things that I might not have. It's a collective enterprise. I'm a dictator when I have to be, but basically, the Matthew Spector, who's our fiction editor, decides with Darcy Cosper and Clarissa Romano, our two other fiction editors, they decide what kinds of things they want to cover, who they want, which pitches perk them up, and they go with them, and I never say no to them. Evan Kindley, and Julie Klein, who carve up a lot of the nonfiction stuff, and Jonathan Hahn, who does politics. They make their picks as well. I then add to their workload by seeing things that I think we should do as well that they hadn't noticed or they hadn't been interested in. But many heads are better than one in an enterprise like this. And I do want the Los Angeles Review of Books to have to be an umbrella. I don't want to predetermine what people are going to look at by always having the same political set of views, although obviously when I make a decision about the intellectual content of something, that may mean that some kind of Tea Party manifesto is not going to make it through the cut, and that's a political decision as well as an intellectual one. But so we're not free of political leanings, but I try to have a range of things from way left Marxist to middle left to middle of the road. We're doing 2 pieces on this week on that our law editor Don Franzen has put together. One is Brian Garner, who is kind of on the Scalia end of constitutional interpretation, and he is going to and Brian Garner kind of tears apart a book that then we did an interview with the author. And we have what is, I guess, one of the more conservative perspectives on constitutional interpretation, back and forth with a very, one could say liberal, although a complicated intellectual perspective on the Constitution that doesn't really fit one or the other of those spectrums, but is identified more with the left end of constitutional interpretation.
This sounds to me like an exciting article to read, and the prospect of a Los Angeles Review of Books was, exciting when I first heard about it. Before I even heard you were starting it, I would think to myself very often, why isn't there a Los Angeles Review of Books? Like there's a New York Review of Books. I read it online quite a bit and enjoy many an article there, but it mystified me for a long time. I would fantasize just about there being a thing called the Los Angeles Review of Books because of Los Angeles being the city in America that fascinates me the most and books being the medium that probably do. But Why wasn't there a Los Angeles Review of Books? Why was this title free for you to take when you were starting a journal?
One of my books, as you mentioned, is called Cosmopolitan Vistas, is about regionalist literature, primarily late 19th, early 20th century, but running through to the present. And one of the interesting things that I found was that this is maybe too recondite, but you can cut it out if it is.
It's never too recondite.
But there's a guy named John T. Frederick who in 1915 is an undergraduate at the University of Iowa. He and his professor are part of that first group of people at Iowa who are interested in contemporary writing and think of it as a reasonable scholarly pursuit. I think the professor was actually a medievalist, but they would get together and they would share their stories and their poems and new writing. He started a journal called The Midland, which was the first of the regionalist small magazines. And it had a kind of Hamlin Garland-like manifesto about New York hegemony over the world of publishing and why the middle of the country needed to speak out, and why they needed their own organs so that they weren't completely controlled by New York publishing. When Frederick wanted to publish his own novels, he went to Knopf and he published with Knopf. And he had his own publishing company at that time called The Midland, right? And that was publishing Midwestern writers for the Midwest, but that's not where he wanted to be. So it's there's always a very double relationship for anybody that's not in New York to the New York publishing world. When I started Los Angeles Review of Books, I understood that. And I picked the name in part because it has a slight steampunk kind of quality to it, right? It's very.
I never thought about it that way, but well put.
Thanks. It's it's very traditionalist. I mean, as opposed to, I don't know, N+1, the rumpus,
right?
The millions, right? It's a throwback kind of title, and because I, in all sorts of ways, am interested in the tradition and where it is moving, but I'm interested in where it is moving. So the name was free, I think, in part because when people thought about how you do a literary magazine on the West Coast, nobody thought of Los Angeles as a literary capital, somewhat unfairly since it is the biggest book market in the world. Nobody thought of it as a book capital, and so nobody thought of it as the kind of right place to locate one's relation to the literary. I thought it was time that people did. Immediately, our readership was global. Some 15% of our readers are in Southern California. Some 30% are overseas. So we are the Los Angeles Review of Books. We do think we have a certain kind of West Coast perspective. Most of our editors are here, not all, but most are, and that is it does give a different slant on the world and on the relationship of tradition and the new, and a relationship of high and low, and the relation, these kinds of things than one finds in the elite New York journals and magazines and publishing houses. So I think that it made sense for us on a number of levels. It's from Los Angeles. It's not about Los Angeles, and it's not for Los Angeles.
But I would say being from Los Angeles makes it entails a certain internationalism. I mean, the city has drawn me here because America's claims on it seem so few. It's the city that's a world in itself, to quote that billboard at LAX with Villaraigosa's face on it. Do you agree that when you're running a journal out of Los Angeles, it's automatically international, it's automatically global, because Los Angeles is itself global, and there's nothing any of us are going to do about that, nothing I would want to do about that. That's why I'm here.
Yes, although it's we don't have as sizable a Hmong population, for instance, as Minneapolis, or as sizable as Somali population as Minneapolis. So I mean, it's hard to find an American city that's not global in those terms. It's true that Los Angeles embraces its relation to the global in ways that not every city does. It's true that Los Angeles's idea of its own global nature, I think, is different than New York's idea of its own global nature. Just to take two examples. In New York, the kind of global reach of high culture is a great strength for New York culture, and everybody understands that. Who is Salman Rushdie? He's a New Yorker, right? In Los Angeles, our kind of sense of what makes us a global city has more to do with taco trucks and Korean spas and this kind of thing than it does simply a kind of high culture middle class, upper middle class, international bourgeoisie notion of how art works and how culture works.
And that's something else that fascinates me about Los Angeles, and I think many people who live here it does, is the fact that there's these high culture, low culture divisions you find in other places. Los Angeles has this sort of indifference, like the universe itself, to whether culture is high or low. It's just, there's something freeing about it. Freedom is a little bit of a buzzword in that context, but I personally enjoy the divisions being lifted in the way they are here. Do you find a downside to that? You've been here longer than I have.
No, I don't see any possible downside to that. No, I mean, I'm very much a kind of let a thousand flowers bloom kind of person in general. There's no question that if one thinks about what non-high culture means, it's so many different things, right? It's the World Wrestling Federation, as well as the comic book, right? It's not one kind of thing. Those are very different forms of culture, and they have different audiences. What we're interested in is mixing up the what we offer people in order to mix up audiences, in order to have those audiences kind of miscegenate, and let them find out about each other, let them bump into each other, let them glean from each other.
I think of essay writing today. The best essays I read are all about connection. They have a subject, they connect it to other subjects, they connect those subjects to the reader. The essayist connects it to themselves the best can. I think of that in my own practice of essay writing. I think of essays as connecting, but also I think of the best essayists as writers who can make any subject into a nexus of all subjects. Do you think that's true?
I think of literature as a cosmopolitan activity. It is when the anti-literary is didactic. Didactic is always the enemy of the literary. The opposite of didactic is a kind of openness. And so you find in the great literature always the author of a great novel looks at side A, looks at side B, looks at side C, and does not adjudicate the claims of these conflicting social groups that the novel brings into play with each other. And it's that lack of judgment, that openness to possibility. It's not a complete openness. It's not like the Ku Klux Klan is just another way to be in the world, right? It's not a complete openness. But it's an openness to the kind of fundamental debates about fundamental human issues, as they are articulated by people who are trying to do their best to figure it out. That's what literature is for. That's why literature does things that and the essay as one of the major literary forms, the novel as another, poetry as a third. These are forms that are designed to, as you suggest, to connect rather than to slough off, rather than to make a decision about any fundamental issue. If you have, for instance, the Thomas Dixon's novels in the 1920s, which were pro Ku Klux Klan, just because I just use that as an example, those novels are not considered great literature, and they're not considered great literature because he was arguing for one side in an ongoing cultural debate of his time. The Harlem Renaissance novels that were published at around the same time, there's some of those are not great literature either because they had a very clear program. But a lot of them are because they were very, very open to, much more open than the other novels of their day, to what the competing claims of black and white culture, or nativist black culture and immigrant West Indian black culture, or bourgeois black culture and lower class black culture. And they looked at all of the kind of competing claims and interests and desires of these cultures, and said, this is why they are in conflict, not this is how you should make your mind up about that conflict.
And this brings me to the idea of the review, of reviews, of book reviews. People will see a title like the Los Angeles Review of Books, or indeed the New York Review of Books. They'll see review and they'll put that in another context and think, oh, book reviews, judgments, recommendations, castigations, what have you. I learned about the coming of the Los Angeles Review of Books with a room full of other people at the Association of Writers and Writing Programs conference in Washington, D.C. a few years back, when there was a panel on book reviews. I was there, you were there. And I expected a little more from the panel. There was a lot of shrugging up there. It's like, well, I guess I run book reviews. There's maybe an audience for book reviews. I don't know. And I had to ask, I don't really ask questions at panels, least of all at an event like that. But I had to ask, or I had to make a point and say, hey, I'm a consumer of book reviews. I read them all the time. That's maybe the form I read most, is the book review. And the fact of the matter is, if book reviews aren't getting read, it's because the book reviews are crappy. There seems to be, I don't know if there's a lot of debate over whether book reviews have gotten worse or better in the last 100 or so years, but they seem to accept that point, all those editors up there. And then you later made a point in the room that you were starting up a Los Angeles Review of Books, where you didn't say this specifically, but the implicit promise is where the reviews won't be crappy, where they're not going to be 400 words of yay or nay, thumbs up, thumbs down. And I want to ask if you think what book reviews have become in the main, is that form... Is there a problem with the form? I tend to think there is, just because judgments of the kind they track toward are not very interesting, inherently not interesting. Do you think that reviews as traditionally conceived are not the best way to go about writing about books?
Well, there are 17 answers to this question. Yes. Number one.
I'll go one by one.
Number one is, there are lots of sorts of reviews. The pre-publication reviews, like Kirkus and Publishers Weekly, they serve a very specific purpose. They do tend to be thumbs up, thumbs down. That is, they will give a number of stars, right? They will recommend them for all readers or for certain readers, this kind of thing. So they carry a strong recommendation, and they're very, very brief. They're incredibly useful for all sorts of people. The newspaper book review does a number of different things. One is it allows a person to be able to talk about a book without reading it.
Yes, we underestimate that advantage at our apparel, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's and not just to talk about it. That's the snide version of it, but also to kind of we can't all read everything. I read for a living, and I'm never even close to reading enough. And most people don't read for a living. They have other lives. And so the book review is a way to kind of keep up with literary culture. And to that extent, it can be brief. It can be judgmental. It can do all sorts of things that, for the most part, we're not that interested in doing it at LARB. But, so I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I don't think the way you ended your question was, is this the best way to run a literary culture? and I think not. That is what people really want, or what a culture needs, is an ongoing serious conversation about its own cultural life. And that's what, we hope to be doing when we're at our best, and that requires something besides, the literary equivalent of Rotten Tomatoes.
And more than the problems of the verdict, which tends to be the least enduring of all elements of a review, is the fact that I enjoy reading reviews from the New York Times Book Review, but some weeks more than others, it seems like the reviewers writing the articles themselves don't. I mean, they kind of care, but they don't really. I mean, they don't feel. the writer does not feel particularly invested in the subject or the book being written about sometimes. I can take that beyond the New York Times. I mean, there's a sense of, as I said before, the shrug, like the undertone of many a review I read, not in the Los Angeles Review of Books, elsewhere. It's like even the reviewer kind of doesn't care sometimes. Do you sense this?
Well, I don't. That's not a general sense of mine. No. And some of my best friends, quite literally, write those reviews.
So you mean they write reviews? They write the reviews where you sense they might not care about the book, or
no, not at all. I meant they write reviews for the New York Times Book Review.
Many of those are good. They're probably writing the good ones.
And exactly, those are the good people. And the LA Times Book Review pages. These are. I think that the practice, the kind of standard practice of assigning a book to a person who seems to make sense, to the editor for that book, encourages people to end up having to talk about a book that they probably they might not have been thrilled about. It doesn't mean that they don't care about it. It just means that the book really didn't rock their boat. That's all. And so, that's because the book was assigned. That gives a kind of objectivity, which is a journalistic goal. To the process, you have an expert in a field, and they're reading a book in their field, whatever that field is, and that should generate a less predetermined verdict and a less predetermined reading of the text. So that's the idea, and so that's the opposite of saying, when people say to me, I'd love to write for you, I say, about what? What do you want to do? And when somebody writes something great for me, I always go back to them and say, what do you want to do next?
Right. Are people sometimes unprepared for you to ask about what? Do they expect you to have certain things you need to have written about, and you'll assign it to them? I mean, does that question surprise them?
In most cases, for professional writers, it surprises them in a nice way, and they think, oh, okay, let me figure it out. Michael Tolkien, for instance, I said, what do you want to write about? And he said, Louis Auchincloss. Right, that was the first thing he wrote for us. And now he's writing a piece for us about Willa Cather's The Professor's House, and that's just because he's excited about it right at this moment. That's what he wants to write about. And so for him, as the minute I asked him, I watched him think about it. And he was ready to go with that. Now, freelance journalism is a tough life at this point. Mm-hmm. My wife is a freelance journalist. I know this very, very firsthand, and of course, she's thrilled to write for us because it's not getting assigned. She's writing about the thing she's passionate about. But I do find sometimes with some professional freelancers that the question is just a little aggravating. It's like, come on, I'm trying to make a living here. Tell me what you want. I'll do it.
See, they have a more utilitarian perspective to the whole enterprise.
They are trying to stay alive. Right.
As utilitarian as you get.
Exactly. And so I understand that. And I sometimes say, well, how about X as a result? Mm. But by and large, writers go into writing because they are not entirely equipped to follow orders.
Yes.
And so that most writers find this just fun and exciting.
Tell me about some of the examples. Doesn't even have to be the pinnacle of what you've seen. I'm not going to put you on the spot for that, but some of the examples of pieces you've run in the Los Angeles Review of Books that have surprised you in the way they have elevated the form of the book essay, done things you didn't expect. Pure surprise, you know what I mean?
For instance, our very first piece by Ben Ehrenreich was a piece called The Death of the Book. And we thought this would be a very funny way to start off a book review. And he had told me that he was thinking about the death of the book. Mm. And wanted thought that's what he wanted to write about. You know, it starts off in a very funny way. It says, I Googled last week. I Googled the phrase "the death of the book," and there were 11.2 million entries. And then I Googled it again yesterday, and there were 13 million entries. and I gave a talk 6 months ago already somewhere about the Los Angeles Review Books. I thought it'd be fun to just check on the number. It was up to 36 million entries. Several million of them were references to Ben Ehrenreich's piece, so that explains part of it. But he was interested in the general phenomenon. He was interested in the talk about it, but he was also interested in looking at Bruno Schulz, fiction writer from middle of the 20th century, who he found really saying very interesting things about the book and about the disappearance of the book in a somewhat kind of fantastic, metafictional, postmodern kind of novel, and it became a very very interesting essay about Bruno Schulz, and not about the death of the book in the standard way that people have decided they're going to attack that subject. And so I loved that. I loved the you could almost see it happening in his mind, which is what a great essay does, right? It represents itself as the thinking of an individual evolving and developing over the course of the essay. And I saw that there was a beautiful piece that was not what I expected when we agreed that that's what he was going to do at all.
It's the essays that reveal the thinking of the writer, but the thinking itself takes a turn that, when I read one of these essays, the thinking itself has to take a turn that my own thinking wouldn't have. Yes. And we're all literally unique. So our thinking is all going to connect, to go back to that verb, to different areas. So, I mean, what you need in an essayist is you need a well-furnished, well-experienced mind, but writing with the clarity and the honesty and perhaps the willingness. Maybe there's not always the willingness in the book review world to lay out your thinking clearly, to reveal honestly how you are thinking about a book or a writer or the death of the book. I mean, there's a certain opacity to some book essays that I read, again, sketching out, this is the problem I don't have in Los Angeles Review of Books essays. Tell me, as a reader of essays on books, what you think about that. I mean, have you seen in the reviews and the essays that dissatisfy you opacity, unwillingness to reveal the sort of paths, the threads of thought on the part of the writer?
The essay as a form covers so much ground. And even essays that have at their center books and reading come in so many different varieties. I'm happy to have an essay, for instance, on let's just say I guess that's not true. I wouldn't be happy with that. I was trying to figure out a topic where it would be okay with me if the author of the essay did not reveal themselves at all.
Oh, I see.
And I think that I can imagine that happening. I'm not coming up with an example right at the moment, but let's say it's a story about actual amount of money that writers are making per word, done over 100-year period, and therefore the kind of possibility that the writers that we want to support are making an adequate living at this point in America, or whether we need to do something to help them, which is of course one of the reasons I started Los Angeles Review Books as well. I was appalled at the idea that writing should be free on the internet and nobody should get paid for writing on the internet, and I'm not doing a good enough job at it yet in getting people paid what they deserve. And to a certain extent, they'll never get paid what they deserve. But to kind of pay top dollar, we haven't raised quite enough money to do that yet. But I'm hoping to. So an essay like that is really it's about books, it's about book culture, it's about but it's factual. One would want it to be factual, and I'm not sure that we would need a rant from that freelance writer who wrote it about about their own life. Yes. Although that might be a fun disjunctive element in the essay, it wouldn't be necessary to it. Now, when somebody's engaged with a great novel, I think it's almost always a mistake to try to remain hidden in that, despite that kind of disappearance of the author. Thing that is, I think that our desire to interact with another mind about books is as strong a desire as our desire to have some new ways of thinking about that book, or some just to get somebody else, to get a read of it, to get a decoding of some of its more difficult passages, or anything like any of the other reasons we look to criticism. I think that kind of interaction with another mind is central, and therefore the revelation is part of doing it well.
You have spoken before and written before about the divide between, let's say, popular writing about books and academic writing about books, and you've talked about how there's interesting academic writing about books inaccessible to the public, generally speaking, whether they can't understand it or literally can't get it or don't know where to find it. Tell me what potential you see in filling in or bridging that gap between popular book writing and academic book writing. What needs to be done to get a greater flow between them, or to hybridize, or I don't even know how you think of it metaphorically.
I think of it less metaphorically than actually practically. When I wrote my dissertation, when I was working on my doctorate, I was already very interested in the idea that I could write this for a general audience. I wanted it to be for a general audience. And it was about the year 1903, which is kind of fun as an idea. It seemed to me a book about a single year. It was also about a nervous disease that was now extinct. So it had a kind of fun medicine as quackery thing. But that the disease was also what led Freud to his concept of neurosis. The disease was called neurasthenia. So it was I thought it was a fun book of interest to any educated reader. Unfortunately, by the time I wrote it, I was severely professionally deformed as a writer.
Professionally deformed.
I had learned how to write academies, and as much as I tried, I hadn't conquered it. I then tried to write some books for a general audience with mainstream publishers, not with academic houses, and with varying success, and still a little bit too academic for a lot of readers. And in fact, I kind of retreated from the first one of those and wrote an academic book next, because I felt so hamstrung by not being able to use all the shorthands I had developed as an academic, that I kind of wanted to work those muscles again as well. So I've been going back and forth trying to do those different kinds of writing. Those of us who are in academia are not always that very good at figuring out what a general reader needs in the way of, one can think of it as translation. I guess I'm getting metaphorical, but it is a form of translation. And what a general needs in the way of a kind of the pace of idea content in a piece, and that is something that we continue to struggle with. I know a lot of people who I've talked to who think that the Los Angeles Review of Books is way too over-intellectual and
what do they point to if that's their argument?
They don't point to specific pieces, but people say, I tried to read it. Good luck with that. It seems great, but it's over my head. To a certain extent, every publication is over some heads. Highlights for Children is over the heads of some younger children, right?
Those puzzles are hard if you've tried doing them in the doctor's office.
Yeah, of course you're worried about your health at that point. So, but it's a constant struggle. I do think that, in particular in the humanities, obviously physicists don't worry about this so much. Medical researchers do not worry about whether their medical articles can be read by the average citizen or not. But because the literary world and I do think that there's always going to be a place for academic work about literature, which the average person cannot read. I'm very happy to have that happening. In fact, what I'm interested in doing is finding those parts of academic discourse that I hope more people could know about, and figuring out how to present them to people. And that's not the same as kind of thinking that literary studies in the academy should be open access to all people, that there should be no jargon, there should be no theoretical words used, and all this kind of stuff, which I think is a silly argument. Nobody says that about the medical research. There's no reason to say it about literary research. Academic jargons are very, very useful. They're incredibly powerful tools for understanding and for communication. And it's not necessary for everybody to know them, for them to be that. But I do want to figure out ways in which we can disseminate those kind of research findings to a larger audience than academics have figured out how to do on their own.
Tell me if you think of or how you think of the idea of trust in terms of writing for the general reader, the non-academic reader, shall we say. I mean, when I'm reading book reviews or listening to radio shows, I mean, whatever it might be, watching a movie, the main quality that can make any of those things unappealing, any of those experiences, any of those media experiences unappealing is that it doesn't trust me to stay with it. It doesn't trust me to think it through. It's terrified that I'm going to click away or turn it off or turn the dial or watch something else. It's that when I sense that fear on the part of a text or a film or anything, that's when it loses me. It loses me by being afraid that it will lose me. Is that a concept that has worked its way into any of your thoughts about what you want to publish, essay-wise, in the review?
Well, I find it less a question about what I want to publish and what I don't, as a question of how I'm editing a particular piece. Part of the kind of problem that I was just talking about, that is the problem of translation, of specialized forms of knowledge. It's always a question for literary culture. Yeah. I grew up reading the New York Times Book Review. My introduction to literary culture was the New York Times Book Review. I was reading the New York Times Book Review for a decade before I became an undergraduate. So a decade between high school and undergraduate life. So it was my main source of information about literary culture. I think about the person who is coming to the Los Angeles Review of Books as a high school student or as a college freshman, and they don't have the range of reference that I have, and you start dropping names, because when you drop the name for a certain audience, what you're doing is getting an entire worldview, an entire way of understanding the phenomenon under question. Out in the open, done, you're moving on. To do that is to exclude every reader that doesn't know that reference, right? And to make that reader. Now, I think that kind of reading over your own head is the only way to get involved in literary culture. You have to read over your head, or you'll never get there. Right? Your reading should exceed your grasp. And so I think that what I do is I look for places in pieces where a deeply subordinated clause or a parenthetical phrase can give a little clarity for readers that are not already specialists, and the places where. And that often works fine, because it's not insulting the reader's intelligence if they do know it. It's a kind of it's parenthetically admitting that some people know it and some people don't, and both groups can appreciate that. It seems to me the necessity for it. What happens is if you have declarative sentences that tell you something that you already know, you feel like you're being talked down to. You feel, I think that makes sense, right? And so we avoid that. But it's a kind of line editing issue more than it is a question of sorting at the front end.
That word clarity, I mean, that's a thing, that's a quality I look for when I'm reading anything, especially essays. I look for reading or writing, actually. Clarity, honesty, curiosity. Those are the three top qualities I want to have if I'm writing. I presume you look for those as well. What else ranks at that level for you?
I like a little bit of obscurity.
As distinct from obscurantism, or are we talking the same?
Yes, right. I mean, as a distinct from clarity, I guess, right? that is, this morning I was working on a piece that's by an academic, about an academic book, and it's a piece that had already had gone through another editor. And the writer was resistant to a lot of that editor's suggestions, which is why it got kicked upstairs to me to work with. One is always negotiating with writers about things like clarity. The writer may want exactly as much clarity as they have, and the editor may want a little bit more. And when that happens, there's a discussion, and the discussion is something that, when it gets tough, you, as an editor, you kind of pick your battles. And so one of the sentences I read today, I thought, this is really not entirely clear. And I thought, I'm not going to fight on this one. This one actually, it has a kind of poetic, somewhat obscure, poetic pushing of the reader out into a kind of a thought that is kind of interesting. I'm not sure once you come back to the sentence, you then understand the sentence any better, but you've had a kind of interesting thought process as part of that. And it's partly because it's slightly obscure. It's a slightly off word at the center of it. But it was productive, I thought, a productive obscuritanism. And that's okay with me. Right. And so, and it's partly because, I knew that there were a lot of other things that were more important for me to change. I was going to let that one go by. But also sometimes, if you read T.S. Eliot's essays, literary essays, you cannot nail down a few of those sentences. They're impossible to kind of say, okay, never going to happen. This is the vehicle for that metaphor. This is the tenor. No, it's not really entirely clear, and that's okay, right? Because what he's doing is making you think really hard about the issues that he's bringing up, and the lack of pure clarity is helpful in that mission. So I'm perfectly happy to let those things go. I do like some humor. You didn't mention that. I do think that
actually I should have mentioned that. For me, it's true too. You can't underscore it enough because of sometimes the resistance to include humor, because that of course means it's not serious. It's not thinking if you have humor.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, this is throwing us way back to the earlier discussion about Los Angeles. One of the things that I worried about right off the bat was that if we got too loosey-goosey too soon, we did too much Hollywoodish stuff. We talked about TV and film too much, which we do a lot of now, but we didn't when we first started out. And we were not as light when we first started out as we are now, or we didn't include as much light stuff. And that was partly because I was concerned about being dismissed as frivolous, fluffy, la landish, right? So I was careful about that at the start, but it was always part of my plan to kind of open up this arena of discussion to a broader array of voices. We did Alice Weiner, who wrote for Spy magazine and has done some New Yorker Shouts and Murmurs over the years, and a very funny writer. He and Barbara Davelman wrote a great book recently called How to Profit from the Coming Rapture.
All right.
Getting ahead for those left behind. He's a very funny guy. And what he wanted to write for us, and it's a very serious piece, but it's about Stephen Potter, the guy who did Lifesmanship, Gamesmanship.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, and it was a very funny essay because Alice is a funny guy, and he was appreciating the humor of Stephen Potter, but a very serious piece as well. It was a full reading of Potter's entire career and bringing back a kind of forgotten mid-century guy who they made a film out of one of the books, and it was his concepts have remained with us. So it's a very interesting piece, but it's fun. I was trying to get Ellis to do and some of his friends. He's on a email chain with Roz Chast and a number of other people, and I thought it would be fun to get them to all do very short reviews of the Petraeus biography.
Oh yes.
And it was fine with me if they hadn't read it. I thought that would be a fun thing. We have done our first graphic review of a graphic novel. I'd like to do more of that. The total word count of that review is probably under 100, right? But unless you count 1,000 words per picture. Right. So, so there are lots of things that don't meet the normal norms of seriousness that I'm hoping to add in. But that was a completely tangential comment to whatever the question was. What was the question?
Nothing's tangential. I mean, we're in new territory now, of course. You mentioned holding down the Hollywood stuff initially with the Los Angeles Review of Books, and that resonates with me because, starting to write about Los Angeles, when I started myself to write about Los Angeles, I immediately thought, Hollywood's not part of my reality here, so I'm not going to talk about that. The freeways aren't a part of my reality here. The smog is not what it used to be. I live 13 miles from the beach. That's not my reality. All the parts of Los Angeles that have been canonically Los Angeles in literature, they have nothing to do with me. I don't have anything to do with them. It's true for millions and millions of people here who all have an expansive experience of Los Angeles, but it's not LA Los Angeles. And that, to my mind, is where the more interesting Los Angeles is to be found. Tell me how have you had any of these rules? This sounds a little rigid, but you mentioned holding down the Hollywood stuff, but staying away from the ways Los Angeles has been written into the ground about over the last 100 years. Is that how high up in your mind as a priority has that been?
Well, I guess to a certain extent, it's not been a priority at all. I do try to get to the beach once a year, whether I need to or not. But when I first got to town, people asked me what I did, and I would often say I'm a writer and an academic, and they said, "Oh, you're a writer. Do you have anything you would like me to look at?" And they meant a screenplay.
Yes.
Because this was the dinner party culture that I had ended up in, and over time, of course, eventually I wanted to say yes.
That's pretty generous. They just offered to look at whatever. Do you have anything?
It may not have been entirely sincere in every case, but in some cases, for instance, when I ask it of people, when people tell me they love books, I said, and they're writers, I say, "Oh, is there anything you want to write about for us?" So it's a real question. People are always looking for great screenplays here, and there are a lot of incredibly smart people in the business, and they are on the lookout for smart stuff. So it didn't surprise me, but it did make me want to write screenplays. And so I did. And the fact is that a lot of the people that write for us, and who will always write for us, are people that have whose main incomes are from the business. It is when you think about writing in LA. The famous Ernest Hemingway thing, Hollywood is great. You just drive up to the border, you throw your book over and they throw you a bag of money and you leave. That's the perfect relationship of writers to Hollywood. But the fact is that writers and Hollywood have a long history with each other, and writing in Los Angeles often means writing for film and television. So, the best writers in Los Angeles often are writing for film and television. And so, to that extent, it would be a bad idea to try to cordon that off. It would be bad for us. It would be bad for who we are. It makes no sense. So we're not doing that. I'm also interested, on a personal level and for the review, in the Hollywood novel and in the Los Angeles novel. So we just did Diana Wagman's new novel. I just did an interview with James Ellroy. These are people who document the city. Seth Greenland, who write novels about L.A., and who are Hector Tobar, right? These are people who are that I'm very interested in as writers, and who are very interested in L.A. So and some of what they do is uses, like Diana Wagman has an old star in the middle of her things, Victoria Patterson's Newport Beach novel. There are kind of stock characters that show up in these novels necessarily, because they are representing the culture, and the culture gets represented in the same way over and over again because it's the same culture over and over again. So I think I'm not disinterested in that, and the review's not disinterested in that. What I was trying to avoid at the beginning was a sense that that's all we were, and that's all we could talk about. But ever since those first few months, it is part of who we are.
You mentioned off mic beforehand that you've lived in Los Angeles 16 years, was it? 16, 17 years, longer than I've lived here. I've only been here about a year and a half. Before I came, I wrote an article for The Millions, the site you mentioned, which runs a lot of book articles. It was about placing myself here by books not normally written about, Los Angeles novels not normally written about in the kind of literature of Los Angeles roundups. Steve Erickson, yes, I included, but like a Vanessa Place or a Karen Te Yamashita, even Christopher Isherwood isn't mentioned so much anymore, so I worked him in. But point being, using literature to place myself here, was that a technique for you as well? Using the literature of Los Angeles as a way to sort of begin to inhabit the place properly?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, for the first 7 or 8 years that I was here, I was still teaching at Iowa, and I was teaching one semester a year at Iowa, and I started teaching a class there on the LA novel, and some of that started before I moved here. Some fairly coincidentally, I directed a dissertation of a PhD student at Iowa on the Hollywood novel. John Paris Springer wrote a great dissertation, which is a very good book on the Hollywood novel, the most complete book on the Hollywood novel.
What did the syllabus look like for the Los Angeles novel course?
Well, I started with some early 20s stuff. Merton of the Movies by a guy named Harry Leon Wilson, who was Gertrude Stein said it was her favorite novel of the 1920s. She was lying, nonetheless. She was being cute and clever and everything, but nonetheless she said it. And it is a very interesting book. It's been made into 4 very bad movies.
4 very bad movies.
Over the course of one with Red Skelton. None of them kind of get at what the book is about, because the book is about subjectivity and about the way subjectivity gets formed in the filmic age. And this is 1922. Also 1922 or 1923 is Edgar Rice Burroughs' The Girl from Hollywood, which is a fantastic, kind of casting couch abuse, cocaine, derelict film directors, nasty producers, the villainy of that's available in the novels of Bruce Wagner, and is already there in 1923 in Edgar Rice Burroughs. It's very fun, interesting novel. So I start with those, and then the Pat Hobby stories. These are books from the 20s and 30s that remain very contemporary in all sorts of ways. And I run it up through Elroy and Bruce Wagner, with stops at What Makes Sammy Run and the kind of the classics. And it's 15 weeks semester, 15 novels kind of course, or 15 or 17 novels. And yeah, those helped me form my sense of the city. But what I did when I first got here was the same thing that I do when I'm traveling, which is I started to wander. Being less virtuous than you, I was not on my bike. I was I was in my car.
Probably had a little more money than I do. I should be working more. Let's face it.
Well, maybe that's it. If you need a ride anywhere, let me know. But I would just cruise around the city, and I would wander through, down, just keep going down 8th Street, 10th Street, 50th Street, 100th Street, 150th Street. Just keep going down and go wandering around and kind of trying to get an internal map of the city. And because the city has ethnic enclaves everywhere, to wander the city is to wander through the various immigrant cultures that make it up, and that's incredibly interesting as well. So I as you were saying earlier, your kind of your sense that you get from film, TV, novel of LA versus your lived experience of LA, to drive that full plat, right? Basically, Hollywood as it's represented, or LA as it's represented, takes place on 3 pages of the Thomas Guide. I mean, the Thomas Guide's probably already been electronified before you got here, but when I got here, we were still using the Thomas Guide to get around. And out of the 220 pages of maps that are the map of Los Angeles, the Hollywood novel tends to take place in 3 or 4 of those pages. LA novel tends to take place in about 10 of those pages. One of the other books on that list is Chester Himes' great novel of LA shipbuilding in the 40s. John Fonte. These are people who kind of take you into other LAs than What Makes Sammy Run, or the Pat Hobby story. So that was so I had a literary introduction to Los Angeles. I also had a kind of car tour version of what Los Angeles meant, and the car tour was the more accurate, or the more kind of complete version of Los Angeles than the literary one.
16, 17 years here. Do you still wander? Can you still wander?
Yeah, I still end up in neighborhoods that I haven't seen before. I still end up on streets that I haven't been on before. Absolutely, it's a big place, as kind of famously large geographically, and when what makes LA includes the whole valley. It includes San Pedro. It includes it includes the San Gabriel Valley as well as the San Fernando Valley. And so and because I teach at Riverside, for me, my sense of what this place is extends into the Inland Empire as well. Yeah, I'm still learning constantly what makes LA. And that's in part, I played in blues bands for a long time in LA as well, and that took me into neighborhoods and communities that I wouldn't have been in otherwise. There's this group called Musicians. They're very strange. And that was part of my education about what Los Angeles was. Now that I'm running the Los Angeles Review of Books and I'm trying to raise money for it, I'm meeting people that I wouldn't have met otherwise, that are involved in the nonprofit world, that are involved in philanthropy in town, and that's another kind of level of the city, layer of the city that I didn't otherwise have access to.
Finally, do you see literature catching up to the sheer scope of Los Angeles? Can it? Has it? We just don't know.
We don't know, and the easy answer is no. No, literature is, for all its desire to be inclusive, for all its cosmopolitanism, for all its attempt to connect. Obviously, no one book can do it all, and not even the full collection of books can do it all. When I started this dissertation about 1903, part of what drove it was this sense that literary history, as it tended to be written, glanced over so much, ignored so much in order to kind of make the argument about some tradition or some phenomenon or some genre or some school. It had to kind of just ignore the vast majority of what had been written. So I thought, well, I'm only going to look at stuff published in this one year, and then I'll really be able to know what literature is covering and what it's not. And of course, I read about maybe 3% of the books published in 1903. I know that I read more books published in 1903 than anybody that was alive in 1903. Right. Right, because I spent 5 or 6 years reading that year, and most people only spent a year doing it, even if they were doing it professionally. So I am, and that record that I accumulated of that sense I accumulated of what was out there, was a tiny fraction. So literature, even if somehow literature, there were enough people writing. I also just wrote a novel that has some autobiographical content. It's a very, very tiny little slice of my life, obviously. I'm just like doing a series of random statements related to the question, and then I'm going to pull them together. Trust me. Sure. Herbert Spencer's 3-volume autobiography, where he tells you what he had for lunch every single day of his life. Also never mentions him masturbating, for instance, right? I mean, there's all sorts of things that are not in this long, over detailed biography of Herbert Spencer, right? Life is not representable in its fullness. And that's just simple fact. And so even if everybody wrote a novel about their life every day, right? Every day a Bloomsday for every person on earth, we're still going to get a very partial record. Although it would be easier because you could say that all anybody is ever doing is writing. And that would simplify things. But no, it's simply the question of representation, as in the use of the word in representative democracy, is always a question of how something is getting distilled or kind of focused into all the prismatic focus into a single beam. That's just the nature of the world and of writing.
I've been speaking here in the headquarters of the Los Angeles Review of Books in Silver Lake with Tom Lutz. He is the founding editor of that publication, and it, of course, quickly has become one of the websites if you're engaged in literary culture in America, or outside of America, indeed. You've got to read. Tom, thanks so much.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Thanks.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everyone who backed this season on Kickstarter: Danny Bolson, Brad and Laramie on Movies, Paul Doyle, Umberto Grant, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovanek, Mark Hines, Mary Gillander, Eric Graham, Will Graham, John French, Andrew Philippon Jr., Kimberly Hahn, Chris Kay, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Rebecca O'Malley, Michael O'Regan, Gail Poole, Blake Riley, Superfan Giovanni, Aidan Nullman, Adam Schaefer, Rob Schultz, Scott Schenker, Cam Smith, Kevin Smokler, Adam Sutherland, TSD, Thomas Interberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.